So after reading the title, you may be wondering what animation there is to analyze with a show like Heroes. It's certainly not the most animated series out there, although considering it's a promotional anime, it shouldn't be expected to be much more. Even still, over its 4-year run, its production has had a few neat surprises, whether it be thanks to talented guests going all out, or regulars using it as an opportunity to experiment with more expressive approaches. Regardless, said moments are definitely worth highlighting, even if it means wading through a lot of formulaic sludge to get there. So join me today as we go through the highs and lows of Super Dragon Ball Heroes. Episode 1. Its staff list, much like future episodes, is composed mostly of Super's staff, including its most prolific names. One particular figure at the top of it all is Tadayoshi Yamamuro. If you're unfamiliar with who he is, he's been with this franchise since the original Dragon Ball series, debuting with its 7th episode and has stayed glued to the series ever since, eventually rising up to be one of its biggest names. He's been essential in the past in rejuvenating the visuals of the series, while also very much being a large reason to the stylistic staleness it's experienced for decades. For better or worse, this is his show in one sense, with his creative control tighter than ever, providing the show's character designs and naturally being its chief animation supervisor, as well as storyboarding the majority of the show, supervising close to half of it, and even directing an episode on one occasion. But let's get to the episode's actual content. So, when this released, there was a lot of criticism regarding the shortness to the much anticipated battle between SSB and Super Saiyan 4 Goku. And looking back, that still holds up as a valid complaint. Not only is it short, but there's hardly anything interesting in how it's executed. It's not exactly bad, but it's far from great, which is very much the theme for the majority of the visual side of the show. Yamamuro's board is just like you would expect. It does nothing new, it's as stock as it could be. Unfortunately, Ryu Namba's direction holds very much to the same quality. There's not exactly a particular animation highlight of this episode. Episode 2. The amount of key animators this time expands quite a bit, and there are some notable names here. The first is Sør, one of Toei's many great action animators, but also a former studio cockpit animator now working for Toei, Hisashi Kagawa, with this marking his first entry on the franchise since Dragon Ball Z episode 279. With more names here, there is more action, so that's a slight improvement over the last one, but it's quite limited. Despite having excellent names like the aforementioned Sør and Hisashi Kagawa, you can hardly feel their presence. Without credits, you wouldn't even know the latter name was here, which is a pity. Kagawa's early work, like many cockpit members, was inspired by Yoshinori Kaneda and had a noticeable stylistic flair to it. And over the course of his career has only continued to improve with time. It's really a shame because it doesn't feel like his talents are being put to use. Even still, there's a lot of nice drawings though, so that's something. Of course, I would take Yamamuro's older designs in a heartbeat, but he has ditched the highlights for the majority of characters and the color design is much nicer, increasing the appeal to them. It's a big improvement over his work from the early 2010s. Outside of the animation, Asakura's direction and Yamamuro's board pair well in creating a foreboding atmosphere within the start of the episode, a nice transition as well, but outside of that, it's pretty forgettable. There is a throwback in the storyboard to the fight between Goku and Cell, although in Yamamuro's case, I can't help but wonder if it is a homage or him just being formulaic. Kinda ironic there's a former cockpit animator here as well. On a side note, the browner skin tone for Goku ironically looks very similar to Toriyama's own coloured illustrations, so there's that. Episode 3. Bit of a shorter staff list this time around, although no new names to mention. The episode's a little more animated than the last, even if it's just mostly loot flurries. It's something. There's also some detailed debris shots scattered throughout the episode and a good camera rotation in one cut. Also, Harmony Cell at the end as well. That's cool, even if the colours are a little muddy. Outside of that, there's nothing else to mention. Like I said earlier, for the first episode, it's not exactly bad, but it is by no means great. Episode 4, so it continues on the trend of an assistant getting promoted to a directorial position and Yamamuro boarding and supervising. It actually reuses a fair few cuts from the last episode, showing it must have been quite strapped for time. I think that's even more clear in how limited some of the animation is, even for Dragon Ball Hero standards. The only thing worth pointing out is the cool smoke effects by Shintaro Mura in the Kumba and Cooler fight. Great shape design, there's a strong sense of volume behind it. But that's episode 4. Episode 5, it's essentially the same Kie staff list as last time, with the exception to Mura being absent and Kagawa returning. Also, the Yamamuro supervising and storyboarding while being paired with newbie directors trend is still in play. And in terms of action, the first fight between Super Saiyan God Goku has a lot of rigid movement for the first part, but kinda standard for heroes. There's also some small animation error with the rocks. Instead of breaking away completely, they just disappear. There's also an odd compositing choice. In one cut, Goku has this red shade over his whole body, with a small error where half the lines on his hand which seem to have been missed, but in both the cut before and many of the ones after, the shade is completely gone. Definitely weird, and again points to the signs of a rushed episode. Anyway, the section where the two are in the air is probably the most interesting bit of animation in the episode. It's timed out well and has a good pace, even if very short. The rest was just loot flurries, nothing new to the franchise of course. And on a side note, I always found it odd how some fans talk as if this is something limited to the modern era of Dragon Ball, when really this style of action has been there from the start. Unfortunately, the Super Saiyan 4 Vegito fight holds too much of what I mentioned with the Super Saiyan God one. It's rigid and flat. I guess it shouldn't be all that surprising to say that Yukihiro Kitano seemed to handle the majority of it. Still though, to leave with a bit of positivity, the background art for Fuse Laboratory stood out, and there's some other nice paintings here as well. Episode 6, it marks the return of Ultra Instinct but also Zamusu, and it's also the conclusion of the Prison Planet arc. And for this episode, the Kie staff list is appropriately bigger. Inaba and Mura are back, and having the extra hands on board is noticed. That is in comparison to the majority of what we've seen so far. A rather smooth flow to characters' actions, although again, like before, these are short little bursts of animation. They never seem to last longer than 15 seconds. But let's move on to the main draw of this episode, that is Goku awakening Ultra Instinct. Naturally, it's not anything to the height of the TV series, considering this is just a promotional anime, quite different in terms of production, but even still, while short, there's good effects work and speedy hits. Artwork is on model for what that's worth, not really anything else to say. Now to the direction, Komatsu returns back to the director role, and he provides some interesting color combinations, such as with the arrival of Fuse Zamusu using purple and pink hues, some nice color symbolism considering these were commonly used for the character back in Super. Komatsu also leans into that reddish color palette he played with in episode 2, giving a dire atmosphere to this battle on this crumbling planet, or planets. Surprisingly, Yamamuro's board includes some interesting framing with a cool motif here and there, a bit of an improvement over his usual output. In summary, this makes it the best episode out of this arc. The weakest one would probably be episode 4, I'm tempted to even say 1, but all things considered, the general quality of the drawings throughout Heroes is probably my main praise point. Yes, it's pretty standard and stock work, but it's well drawn. Even if the style is just whatever for me, don't really love or hate it. Episode 7. First to the staff list, Miyako Tsuji, a big name from Super, being one of the chief animation supervisors, finally steps into Heroes, who from this point will start to be quite active in the show. Yamamuro also fills the position of director. This is the first time he's filled this role since Resurrection F. Surprisingly, despite having a slightly smaller number of staff than last time, it's probably the most action-packed episode so far, and manages to be more interesting animation-wise than the last. The episode from start to finish is filled with great effects sakuga, and although Kitano was one of the weaker animators on Super, and well, thanks to a terrible schedule, it made his output worse, there's some really good work here. The scene as Kami comes through the smoke has a really detailed and interesting design. Also, within another smoke-related scene involving Kale, her actions and how she pulls back her hand to clear the smoke and fire a volley of ki attacks has some nice energy behind the movements. Kitano's never been one for dynamism, however, surprisingly there are poses that very much are dynamic, and paired with some good anticipation and solid timing, it's a neat cut. Another little highlight of the action was after Kami dodges Hit's attack, instead of floating back or Kitano just holding the key pose, she does a series of flips. Additionally, there's a bit of nice overlapping action with Hit's cape, great pose as well, like the strong curves. It's always great to see when an animator puts in the extra bit of effort to add a bit more life to a cut, even if it might not be all that significant in the grand scheme of things. Overall, not a bad Heroes episode. If anything, I would say it's better than the last arc's finale, definitely an improvement so far. Episode 8. This time Kazuya Kurosawa, a regular director and storyboarder on Super for some time, and who also storyboarded the fight between Vegeta and Broly in Dragon Ball Super Broly, steps into the show directing this one. I guess it should be of no surprise that this episode is rather solid in that department. It's convincing enough that it makes you feel like you're watching a regular episode in the Super series itself. His music selection is also great, quite atmospheric. A pity he couldn't storyboard this one as well. Nothing to really note animation wise, a lot of reused stuff, and it's pretty heavy on dialogue. Even still, the general quality I think is still a bump up from the first arc again. Episode 9, director Takao Kiriyama makes his debut on the franchise. Like many of the directors mentioned prior, he had been another Toei trainee during the time of Super, although in his case, his director debut would be on Procure, handling the eye catchers. He's definitely skilled and his work is competent, but doesn't provide anything that distinct on Heroes. In terms of animation, Kitano again handles the highest amount of cuts on the episode, however it's a bit rougher than usual, hardly anything that interesting on the visual side with the exception to some of the background art. Quite a nice colour palette, and that Yamamuro uses his older style of shading from the 90s randomly just for one cut, but that's it. Episode 10. It has essentially the same staff list as the last one, with the exception to Mora being absent, and Yasuhiro Namatame, who supervised a handful of episodes on Dragon Ball Super with some key animation on occasion, jumping in. Overall though, its level of quality is very much the same as the last. Some jerky motion with okay storyboarding. There might be a great shot here and there, but it's pretty stock work. I do like the idea of Goku taking out two characters at once though, that was cool. Episode 11, this marks Naotoshi Shida's entry into Heroes. It's quite a short scene and unfortunately but not surprisingly, it's pretty heavily corrected by Yamamuro. At least they are not all full redraws and Shida's shading makes it in a bit, allowing his drawings to still feel three-dimensional, the opposite of what Yamamuro's provides, so that's something. The animation itself features his regular quirks, flapping mouths and great impact frames. It's a little more limited than usual, although it's probably the most interesting bit of animation in the episode. Outside of that, there's a nice hit or two from Jiren. Guessing this is Kitano, nothing out there, but it holds impact. Unfortunately, the episode features probably some of its poorest animation we've seen yet as well, with this incredibly limited cut of Trunks. Literally feels like a Dokkan animation, not too hot. Episode 12, so just going off the credits, it's already shaping up to be a bump up in quality than the prior episodes. Thank goodness for that. For one, and probably the biggest reason of all, is that Yamamuro steps away from storyboarding, but what makes this swap significant is that it's Kazuya Kurosawa who returns to board it. There are also some new names as well on the key A list. Firstly, there is Akira Kano. He came into the franchise with Battle of Gods, supervised a few episodes on Super, and contributed key animation on Super's final episode. While he hasn't been heavily involved with the franchise, he has a huge amount of experience under his belt, with credits on shows from Initial D to Attack on Titan. Thereafter, we have Yuka Kubota. His only work on the franchise prior was on Dragon Ball Super Broly. He's a largely unknown name at this point. Then finally, Midori Sawaki. Interestingly enough, his first entry on Dragon Ball would be all the way back with Dragon Ball Z's fourth movie, but wouldn't make his way back to the franchise until Dragon Ball Super. He debuts on the series with episode 68. but this time would stick around a little longer, now being a regular and even supervise 2 episodes with some assistant supervisor work on another. But outside of the credits, does the episode actually live up to the names on it? Well, for once, it does. The battle around the middle of the episode between Golden Metal Cooler and Kumba is easily one of the best choreographed and animated fights Heroes has had up until this point. I genuinely don't hate Yamamuro, so please don't take it this way, but it actually features dynamism and a lot of it. It's a breath of fresh air. And thanks once again to Shintaro Mura, it's well executed. You have quite a long cut of the two going at it, and it features quite complex camera work, from the top-down perspective to zooming in and tracking Cooler's fist. It's great to see. Even more so difficult to pull off considering the amount of line needed for each of these designs. I also like how he uses quite large white chalky brush strokes as Kumba flicks around. It's a pretty fast motion and it makes it all that bit more clearer to the viewer with it added. The second little highlight of this fight is the clever transition of Cooler's beam and Kumba's eye. It's simple but dramatic and is another reason I'm happy Kurosawa handled this one. Then finally there's the cut as Cooler overheats. Heroes at this point has had barely any good character acting, if any at all, and honestly the franchise in general, regardless of the era, has usually been quite limited in this area, so it was a nice surprise. Mura illustrates a variety of intense and painful expressions, which is achieved in how he exaggerates the size of the mouth and arches the eye up. After 11 episodes of consistently stock expressions, it makes it even better. I'm genuinely surprised with Yamamuro supervising, it made it through. Episode 13. So with the last episode featuring some of the best fights yet, you would kind of think it would be some time until there would be another episode that would top it in terms of its visuals. I doubt anyone would have expected that would be achieved within the very next episode. Thankfully, Kurosawa is back again, but so is the popular action ace Naotoshi Shida, who steals the show and was half the reason I was ever interested in even making this video. It's ironic how he went from producing one of his shortest scenes on modern Dragon Ball to one of his longest out of any episode. And if that wasn't enough, the quality of it is as good as any of his work on the Super TV series, if not a little better again. Yes, who would have ever thought? Even still, before getting lost in the Shida hype, he's not the only reason this episode looks as good as it does, as you have another staff change up this time around with the supervisor role. After 12 episodes, Yamamuro now steps away from another position, that being the animation supervisor role, and again it's very much a positive thanks to Miyako Tsuji taking over. Now while her work on Super, both in terms of her drawing style but also animation, has hardly been of that much interest to me, that's completely not the case here. Her style is almost the opposite to that on Super's. Hair features more natural shapes with a lot more curves, giving that loose feel to it. Faces are drawn with more curvature as well as other features like the eyes and nose. Definitely stylistic notes drawn from Dragon Ball's older designs than Yamamuro's current ones. Anyway, let's actually delve into the episode itself and start with Tsuji. The main part kicks off with very detailed effects work, then some strong actions thereafter. At the same time, there's a loose quality to them. This is partly in how she uses smears and exaggeration, but more so the flow to the poses themselves. The whole scene is backed up nicely with a dynamic board. There are some fun angles here that you don't too often see in Dragon Ball. I guess some more irony is that her work here exceeds anything she animated on Super. But moving on, it's Shida time. His classic effects work starts his scene off and carries a punch like always. The way he executes it is through the rather high frame rate he commonly works with, and will continue to do so throughout this scene, but also the number of elements he throws together in a short burst. First, it's the big purple beams. The spacing between each one is large and being timed out on mostly 1s and 2s, it goes by of course really quick, and the flattening out of the background to just black, which contrast and value to the bright white in the center makes it pretty easy to take in despite its speed. There's then the second element, the explosion with stacks of little bits of debris, then the third, a massive smoke cloud right after. All of this takes place around 3.5 seconds. It's smooth and effective in catching your attention. Thereafter, Shida's camera work comes into play. Even though these are rather quick movements, they're still clear, and of course, you have plenty of great drawings. Like any show Shida's on, he does his own thing and breaks away from the model sheets. In this case, stripping everything down to 2 tones, completely removing highlights from the hair, and pushing expressivity in both facial expressions and poses. Overall, it's a spectacular scene and is probably one of my favourite things to come out of Heroes, and hats off to Tsuji for not correcting everything, very much appreciated. Episode 14, unfortunately we're back to the standard stock poses and framing. Like you might have guessed, that means Yamamuro is back in both the supervisor and storyboard role. And there's not really anything that stands out. The dramatic shift in colour that director Takao Kiriyama uses when Kamioran transforms is a nice touch, and some smoke effects in the final scene had a realistic flow to them, but that's really it, a pretty bare bones episode. Episode 15, so Miyako Tsuji is back as animation supervisor, and Hirotaka Nii also makes a return to the franchise. Nii came on with Super, and while his work initially wasn't overly noteworthy, improved over time, and to the point he was entrusted with handling one of the biggest moments in the Tournament of Power, so it's great to see him back. There's also another new name that joins the team, Tatsuya Oka. Like many of the other latecomers on Heroes, he supervised a couple of episodes on Super and worked mainly as a key animator. For whatever reason, Toei's own staff list is a little smaller again, with some outsourcing to Studio A.L.I.S.O.N. Despite the low numbers, the skill of the animators themselves make up for it and deliver a more engaging fight than the last episode. Going from the start, you have Nii, and while a little conservative, he's animated quite a strong kick from Goku. The anticipation behind it is great, there's a very long hold and a nice impact. As I said, pretty conservative, but it's nice. It's also great seeing his uncorrected artwork. Like Tsuji's, the lines are sharper, and he leans back into the franchise's older designs, even with the shading around the cheek. It delivers a much more expressive look to characters, and makes his take on UI Goku one of my favourites. A little later on, and it's Nii's work again, and like before, you have a similar style and execution in the sense of limited but strong actions. If anything, it reminds me a bit of the work by Segasha's team on Z, in regards to full screen smears and long holds in anticipation and after a hit. It's fun and has impact. There are a couple of more complex cuts later on and some great drawings. It's good to see expression and curvature to features instead of sticking to straights, which is partly why Yamamuro's drawings have that sense of rigidness about them. Unfortunately, there's a bit of quality drop at one point. I'm guessing this is Quintana going off the faces. Surprisingly, he went mostly uncorrected, but it's more so the awkward slide and the fact that the trajectory of the beams don't change either. They're kinda like floating through. Again, feels like a Dokkan animation, at least for the most part. UI Goku's appearance thereafter is good. Not a bad episode for hero standards. Episode 16, so Yamamuro is back as supervisor, another animator joins the staff list, Shuichi Iijima, however remains as a regular going forward. Iijima's entry on Dragon Ball was with Dragon Ball GT, assisting different studios such as Carpenter and Segasha, and naturally being there for Toei's own ones. And the second inclusion is Takeru Shinazuka. Even though he's perhaps a Toei name that's a little less known, that's certainly not a reflection on his skill. His work is very loose, and so much so some have confused him for Ryu Onoshi. Unfortunately, he contributes the smallest amount out of everyone. With his skill, it would have been great if, like Shida, he could have been given a lengthy battle sequence, although it's highly likely he was busy on other shows and that wasn't really possible. The best bit of action in the episode is when Zamusu takes everyone out. The big punch he does into Vegeta especially reminds me of animators like Taiichiro Ohara in Z, who would really exaggerate and stretch the body to express the impact of a punch. There are some nice effects in here as well, but that's really it. It's an episode pretty heavy on dialogue, and the rest of the action is, yeah. On the directional and storyboard front, Hit's entrance was well done. Great drawing there as well, so thumbs up there. Episode 17. This episode marks the arrival of Gogeta, but also the finale with the battle against Hearts, and so the Kie staff list is almost doubled, which is expected considering this episode is action-based, and outside of some rather obscure names that return back to the series. This also leads to Shuichiro Manabe coming back to the franchise for his one and only appearance on Heroes. In comparison to his prior work, this isn't anything special, but his work is probably the strongest out of everyone in this episode. Miyako Tsuji is also the highest credited, although there's nothing that grabbed my attention with exception to her effects work. That was a nice surprise. Hirotaka Nii makes a decent contribution. although it's more so his drawings which are the highlight for me and is what I like this episode most for. And on that note, I have to mention another name who has a large part in that being Takeo Ide, who supervises this episode. To anyone who's familiar with the staff list behind Super or even Z, you're no doubt familiar with who he is, but for those who aren't, Ide has been with the franchise from the start with Dragon Ball and would continue to rise through the ranks. He's behind a stack of iconic moments, and by the time of Super, his main role would be as a chief animation supervisor, so it's interesting seeing another quite prolific name from Super's production make it over to Heroes and now become a regular. With that said, I wouldn't say it's anything out there, but at the same time, it's especially hard to be when weighed down by a mediocre storyboard. I mean, Minabe's action is fine, there's a cool spin there, but it simply just doesn't live up to the names on it. At least we get some nice clothing and hair Sakuga with Gogeta, so it's not a total loss. Episode 18. This one is directed by Takao Iwai. He's one of the few directors on Heroes that's a Toei veteran. Even still, there's nothing about his work that is overly noteworthy, and that goes for everyone here. You've got the regular staff list and it's just the regular output. The best part of the episode would be from Tsuji as Gogeta is dodging Heart's key attacks and dashes forward. The movement is energetic with cool effects work, some quite strong poses and drawings as well. It's a good little scene. Really, nothing else to say about this one. Episode 19, it's the big finale to this arc. Unfortunately, it doesn't really have that strong of a finish. I would say Iwai's direction is a step up, there's actually some atmosphere towards the end, some genuinely nice shots. I'm unsure what the Omni King hide and seek adds, but it happened. Although in the animation department, despite having a fairly solid list again, and a couple of extra names to balance the workflow, it doesn't break from the norm whatsoever. And honestly, it doesn't even feel like anyone was trying for it to be. The most interesting work here would be from Tsuji and Nii. Nii's take on Gogeta and other characters like Trunks, despite being corrected, was good. His actual animation is okay. The release for the Kamehameha was quite weightless, certainly below what he's capable of. Tsuji's work once again is the highlight out of everyone, animating Gogeta taking out Hearts. Outside of the animation though, I do remember being a little sad after hearing Heart's final bit of dialogue, so the fact that Heroes managed to extract even the smallest bit of emotion out of me, I compliment it for that. I would like to have more positives to throw towards an arc's finale. It would be great to end on a good note, but yeah, that's unfortunately not the case. So final thoughts for the Universal Conflict arc. The best episode would be 13 hands down. It's amazing what a good storyboard can do, and even more so when you have excellent animators around. Worst episode was probably 9. Once again, over the course of the arc, the only element of consistency was the quality of the drawings. Definitely better than the last arc thanks to Tsuji, Nii, and Shida's contributions. The main problem of this arc, like you might have guessed, is you just have a constant stream of bland storyboards by Yamamuro, alongside one of Super's poorest animators, handling the highest amount of cuts on a lot of episodes. It goes without saying that doesn't make for a good combo, even if Kitano's work is an improvement over his time on Super. Anyway, we have a 1 episode arc, so let's cover that before finishing off. So yeah, episode 20 is a bit of a random episode if you're not really familiar with the games like me. Bit of a jarring jump, but to the episode of course, you have all the usual names. Iwai's directing again, Itai and Tsuji are here, and Ide is still in the supervisor role. Kinda a surprise that Yamamuro didn't jump back in. So far, whenever you have a supervisor swap up, it'll be for 1 episode and Yamamuro will be back for the next. But this time he's been absent for 3 in a row, but that's hardly a negative. And he's still the chief animation supervisor of course, so his corrections still make it in here. To the animation now, it's standard Dragon Ball action by Koji Nishizawa, but he still uses indented cheek shading like his work on Super, so I salute him there. The later scene by Inaba very much follows the same quality. Of course it isn't bad, but again it just doesn't do anything new. However, the one animator's work who stands out again, probably you can guess it, Tsuji. Honestly, I've never paid that much attention to her work before this video. There was nothing about her style on Super that stuck out to me like I said earlier, but during this rewatch she's proven herself time and time again, easily etching out herself as one of the best regulars, and here she shows that again. Each character's actions have a smooth pace with a feeling of weight behind each blow, with great effects in between. The blur definitely takes away a bit of the oomph from behind some of them, but it's still great. Also, didn't expect the beam to come out after Vegito took that hit, so props to Yamamuro's board for the nice surprise and a wise use of colour, quite striking. But that is episode 20. Definitely some odd drawings here and there, but for the most part it was well done. However, that brings us to the end of part 1 of the Heroes rewatch. Thank you for enduring Heroes with me. I've also only watched up to the Universal Creation arc, so it'll be interesting going in fresh next time to some of the later episodes. With that, thank you for watching, hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you later.